When it comes to properties as popular and as long-lasting as Thomas & Friends, you have to expect that some chancers will want a slice of the pie as well, leading to many unlicensed toys based on Thomas and various other characters. One company that produced such items was called Fenfer, who, in 2009, brought out a range of bootleg Thomas products called Southwood Toys, which in and of themselves have been bootlegged by a number of other companies in the years since. Most of the toys in the Southwood range were obvious clones of existing Thomas characters, but I sometimes wonder, what if the bootleggers had tried to be a little more original? If I start drawing, maybe I can find out. After creating some mood boards, the first thing I did was draw sketches of each character before committing to the full pieces, which allowed me to know exactly what I was going to be drawing in advance. When figuring out ways to differentiate the Southwood engines from the Thomas characters on which they are based, I decided to focus on their considerably bulkier appearances versus the originals. This change was done to accommodate the larger battery compartment that houses two AA batteries rather than the single AA or C batteries of the Tomy Playrail engines. The extra battery was presumably needed to power the lights and the sound chip, which consisted of generic train noises that have plagued many a cheap toy train for a good number of decades. I'm not going to play the noise in order to spare your eardrums, but I'm sure a fair portion of viewers will know exactly what sounds I'm talking about. For inspiration, I decided to use real engines that have a bulky, functional look. Most British steam engines, even the scrappiest of industrial locos, have an air of grace and elegance about them. So I decided to look overseas for more suitable prototypes. I considered basing them on Chinese designs. It seemed fitting considering that the Southwood toys originate there. Unfortunately, I struggled to find much information about Chinese locomotives, and finding designs that even remotely matched the looks of the Southwood engines proved difficult. I thought about other countries that had functional, bulky designs for their steam engines, and thought about Russian locomotives. The Southwood line did have a Russian localization, so it's not completely irrelevant. For most of these engines, I'm combining elements from multiple real-life classes rather than have them be one-to-one with a single type of locomotive. Having said that, I decided to base the Thomas bootleg largely off of the 9P, a shunting locomotive from the Soviet era. The Southwood trains had variants where the faces are replaced with smokebox doors, complete with a headlamp. I decided to incorporate the headlamp into the face to set the Southwood redesigns further apart from the Thomas characters. At one point, I played around with the idea of the headlamp being an eye, resulting in these ghastly drawings depicting Not Thomas as a bizarre Mike Wazowski wannabe. In the end, I went with using the headlamp as the nose instead, which looks a bit better. I decided to base Not Thomas's expression off of the original Southwood toy, which is a surprised expression based off of the Tomy Thomas and the Jet Engine pack, albeit modified to look a bit chubbier. It also has larger eyebrows that point downward, making it look less like he's surprised and more like he's shouting angrily. With this in mind, I decided to call him Boss. Perhaps he's the leader of the Southwood team and likes to boss the other engines around to keep them in order. I toyed with the idea of making all the text Cyrillic, but ultimately decided to go with the Latin alphabet since it's what the majority of the Southwood toys use. Speaking of which, what is Southwood? What does the name refer to? I decided that, in this quasi-reboot, the Southwood Corporation is a transit company that specialises in the delivery of goods and is home to a large shunting yard that is always full of trucks. Speaking of the trucks, I initially drew them with headlamp eyes before swapping them out for regular eyes and making the nose a headlamp so that the trucks would match the engines. I like the idea of the headlamp eyes for the trucks, however, so maybe I can use that for a different project. And so, here is the original Southwood Thomas bootleg, and here is Boss, my reimagined version. You'll notice with the Southwood engines that they didn't go the obvious route when it came to making characters other than Thomas. You'd think they'd have bootlegged the likes of Percy, James, Gordon, etc, but nope, they skipped the entire Steam team and went with Duck for their next engine. There are bigger Southwood experts than myself who could probably confirm or deny this, but I suspect that the Duck chassis may have actually been the starting point for the Southwood range. The splasher and toolbox detailing on all the Southwood engines is similar to the Tomy Duck, and the Southwood Duck probably looks the least distorted out of all of the Southwood engines, even if he is still a bit misshapen. Incidentally, Duck is the only Tomy engine to have been bootlegged in the Southwood range that originally used a C battery as opposed to a AA, which might explain why he was able to adapt to the 2xAA layout a little easier. The Southwood Duck came in two colour variants, the standard green and also orange. Maybe they were trying to cash in on the railway children. Either way, I decided that using the orange colour scheme for Not Duck would be a good way to set him apart from the original Duck. I designed this engine to be similar to a Kolomensky Type 76, albeit with longer tanks that reach the front of the smoke box. I decided to name the engine Express, mainly due to the Russian localization of the Southwood line, in which Duck has that name written on his side. The same also holds true for the Bill bootleg, but I have a different name in mind for him. Express is the oldest and slowest engine owned by the Southwood company. As a result, his name is typically used sarcastically. The trucks don't like it very much when Express is scheduled to be the engine in charge of them, and groan when they have to be pulled or pushed by him. Express is either thick-skinned or hard of hearing, since he doesn't seem too bothered by the truck's reaction to his presence. He might be slow, but he remains focused on his work, and so he can generally be relied on to get the job done, even if he can't be relied on to do it particularly quickly. And, with that said, here is the Southwood Duck bootleg, and here is Express, my reimagining of it. The next engine we're covering is Bill, or Ben. I don't think it was ever made clear which one they were ripping off. There have been quite a number of variants of this tooling released by Fenver and various other companies over the years, so perhaps some are meant to be Bill and some are meant to be Ben. I found an image of a variant of the Southwood Bill /Ben tooling that had Be Happy written on his side. My first thought was that it was intended to be an abbreviation for Be Happy, although in hindsight I was probably giving the bootleggers too much credit. I say this partially because the B is written on his bunker whilst the Happy is written on his tank, so the other side would probably read Happy B. I also say that because the same company appears to have made a diesel bootleg with the text See Happy on the side, and I don't think that's a phrase that people actually use. Nevertheless, I decided to name the Bill bootleg Be Happy, and figured that this could play into his personality. He wants everyone to be happy, but isn't interested in actually learning to understand why his colleagues are often unhappy, and making changes accordingly. As a result, most of the other engines just find him to be annoying. Boss has run into a particularly unpleasant situation where he has broken down, but the only engine available to help him is Be Happy. So not only is Boss unable to move, but he's stuck with the worst possible engine to encounter in this situation. Hello Boss, broken down again have you? Well, don't be sad. Remember, positive vibes only. Giving advice that bad should be a fireable offence, muttered Boss with what little puff he could muster. Bootleg Bill, which sounds like the name of a character from an anti-piracy PSA, was himself bootlegged and modified multiple times, not only into different colours, but also a heftier modification with a smokebox door and vaguely Japanese-style loco detailing. At this point you can barely tell it's a bootleg Thomas toy at all, and sort of passes as its own thing, less of a knockoff and more a generic toy train. I don't doubt that the plastic is so low quality it can probably shatter into a million pieces if played with too roughly, but you know, baby steps. And, with that said, here is the Southwood Bill knockoff. And here is Be Happy, my take on the toy. The next character to be bootlegged in the Southwood range was Rusty. Because all the engines used the same chassis, the Rusty bootleg was erroneously given side rods, which I'm going to use to my advantage. Also, much like how Duck had an orange variant, Rusty had a green variant, which, once again, I'm going to be using to my advantage. I have based my interpretation of Not Rusty largely on the TGM-23 diesel hydraulic locomotive. This is another Soviet design, built between 1962 and 1977. I've made the front black to match the toy, with the rest of the body being green. Rather than the nose/headlamp being on the front of his body, it's instead attached to the railing at the front of the engine, as I figured that it would make more sense for the lamp to be there, even if it means that the engine's nose isn't attached to his body. I'll admit there isn't a huge amount to talk about when it comes to Southwood Rusty, since he's not the most interesting addition to the Southwood range. I suppose I could figure out a name and personality for this version of the character. In keeping with the vaguely Russian theme present with my take on the Southwood engines, I figured that I could give this engine a Slavic name. Maybe Rostislav is a good name for him. Similar to the name of the character he's based on, but etymologically different. The name means to increase glory or fame. Perhaps Rostislav has ideas above his station, believing that he's cut out for a better life than the one he has, and dreams of being famous. Maybe he tries to be courageous in the hope that he'll be recognised for his daring feats, only to make things more difficult for the people and engines around him. These misadventures bring him back down to earth, but his humility rarely lasts long. And so, here is the original Southwood Rusty bootleg, and here is Rostislav, my interpretation of him. Now we've come to the last engine, a Duncan ripoff, although you perhaps struggle to tell from images of the toy, or at least you would if it weren't for the fact that his name is written on his side. The Southwood Duncan is an interesting case, because Fenfer, the toy company that originally produced the Southwood bootlegs, originally designed a Duncan knockoff but cancelled him during the prototype stage, presumably because it looked like this. However, like I said before, the Southwood toys were later bootlegged themselves, and other knockoff companies managed to get their hands on the unused Duncan tooling and put it to good use. The word good being in massive inverted commas. The Duncan bootleg doesn't really evoke the character of Duncan at all. He's got a massive swollen boiler and tiny boiler mountings, which is not at all like the real Duncan, who has a fairly slender boiler and a famously tall funnel. To be fair, even the original Tomy Duncan struggled a bit with the proportions, but bootlegs have quite a nasty habit of accentuating the jankier aspects of the toys they're ripping off. Like with the Rusty knockoff, I had to make this engine standard gauge rather than narrow. I based it on number 742, which is apparently another example of the 9P class, like what I based Bootleg Thomas, aka Boss, on. I struggled to find much information regarding this engine, so I'm not actually sure whether or not there was a well-tanked variant of the 9P, or if number 742 just lost its side tanks at some point. It's currently a static display piece, and I couldn't find any images of it during its working life. Another member of the class, number 178, also lacks side tanks, so presumably this was an actual variation of the class. Darina, as I've decided to call her, is not exactly the jolliest of engines. She seems to be annoyed by virtually everything and everyone. Sound like anyone we know? Compared to Boss, who is very shouty, Darina prefers to stay out of the other engine's way. She may get easily annoyed, but tries to do what she can to minimise that annoyance, even if it means keeping herself to herself. Incidentally, one thing I wish I'd done is include the tenders that frequently come with the Southward engines. It might seem like an error on the part of the bootleggers to include them, since the only engines in the range are either tank engines or diesels, who theoretically wouldn't have much need for conventional tenders. But at the same time, such a thing could have been needed. Some tank engines had low coal capacity and thus would carry tenders if travelling longer distances. My excuse is that all my drawings take place in and around the big yard, and thus the engines haven't needed tenders. But, with that said, here is the bootleg Duncan toy, and here is Darina, my retake. And there we are, the Southward engines reimagined as its own entity separate from Thomas and Friends. It was interesting to draw these engines and figure out how to make them different enough from the characters they're based on, while still retaining elements from the bootleg toys. Plus, it's been a nice change of pace drawing engines and environments that I wouldn't typically get a chance to draw. I hope you've had a good time exploring these strange bootleg toys, and hopefully you're excited to see what I do next. Either way, make sure you're subscribed, and don't forget to like, hype and comment on the video if you want to see more stuff from me.